Here is something that breaks most people when they think about it too hard. The planet is drowning in debt. The United States alone is sitting on $38 trillion of it. Japan has another $9 trillion on the books. Add it all up, every nation, every government, every central bank, and you are looking at $315 trillion in total debt. That is 3 times larger than the entire global economy. But here is where your brain should start hurting. If everyone owes money, who are they paying? Who is sitting at the top of this pyramid collecting? Who is the creditor when literally everyone is a debtor? The answer is going to disturb you. Because when you actually trace the money, when you follow the chain of who owes what to whom, you discover something deeply wrong. The world does not owe money to anyone external. It owes money to itself. The debt is circular, self-referential, a closed loop where everyone simultaneously owes and is owed. But that is not an accident. 4 specific people, 4 bankers, spread across 300 years, engineered it to work exactly this way. They built a machine where debt becomes permanent, where governments can never escape borrowing, where interest payments flow in one direction forever, and where the architects of this trap profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout. This is not speculation. These meetings happened, the contracts exist, the mechanisms are public record, and once you see what they built, you will realize that $38 trillion in United States debt is not a problem that needs solving. It is the system functioning perfectly, exactly as designed. Let me walk you through the 4 architects, the 4 moments when this trap was constructed, and why every government on the planet is now locked inside it with no way out. Before 1694, when kings needed money, they did it the straightforward way. They would approach wealthy merchants or nobility, promise to repay with interest, and everyone understood the deal. If the king could not pay, he would default. Creditors would absorb the loss. The king would find someone else willing to lend. It was risky for lenders, embarrassing for kings, but it was contained. Debt was temporary. Either the debt was repaid or the borrower defaulted. The system cleared itself. William Paterson changed everything. He was a Scottish merchant who had failed at multiple schemes to make his fortune. In 1691, he developed an idea that would fundamentally reshape how governments functioned. England was locked in expensive wars with France. King William III desperately needed funding. The royal treasury was empty, and traditional lenders were refusing to extend new credit because England had a history of defaults. Paterson went to the king with a proposal. He would organize wealthy merchants willing to lend the government £1.2 million, roughly $300 million in today's purchasing power. But here is where it gets interesting. The loan would never be repaid, not eventually, not when finances improved, never. Instead, the government would pay interest forever, 8% annually in perpetuity. And to manage this, Paterson proposed creating the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders would contribute their gold to this new bank. The bank would lend it to the government would make annual interest payments from tax revenues, and the bank would distribute those payments to the lenders. But the critical innovation was that the government would never repay the principal. The loan was permanent by design. Why would merchants agree to this? Because the interest payment was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to extract taxes from citizens. As long as England existed and could tax its people, the interest would flow. And the bank notes the lenders received could be traded, sold to other investors. They were more valuable than money because they paid interest automatically. Parliament approved Paterson's scheme in 1694. The Bank of England received its charter. And for the first time in human history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, but a feature of the system, a tool of governance. The government paid £96,000 per year, flowing to the merchant lenders forever. They had purchased an annuity from the government, a permanent income stream. As long as England existed, the money would keep coming. And if they wanted their gold back, they could simply sell the notes to someone else. The debt was transferable between creditors, but never repayable by the debtor. But Paterson's real genius was what came next. The Bank of England was granted the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. They could print paper money up to the value of the loan. This created money out of debt itself. The government's IOU became currency, and the more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This is the template. The government borrows money, never repays principal, pays interest forever, and the debt itself becomes the foundation of the money supply. It is brilliant if you are a banker collecting interest. It is catastrophic if you are a taxpayer funding those payments in perpetuity. Within 50 years, every major European power had copied the model: France, the Netherlands, and by 1790, the newly independent United States. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America's financial architecture on the Bank of England. Permanent debt, interest paid from taxes, bonds traded as currency. Paterson died in 1719, not wealthy despite creating the Bank of England. But the system he built persists 331 years later. British government debt has never been paid off. It has been refinanced, rolled over, expanded, but never eliminated. The debt trap was set in 1694, and every government since has walked into it willingly. By the early 1800s, European governments had fully embraced debt. They borrowed to finance wars, build infrastructure, and cover operating expenses. But there was no organized market. Each loan was negotiated individually, interest rates varied wildly, and only the wealthiest merchants could participate. Nathan Rothschild changed all of that. He did not just participate in sovereign debt, he industrialized it and turned it into a machine. The Rothschild family started as money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, the five brothers had established banking houses in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was unprecedented. They could move money and information across borders faster than anyone else, including governments. They used this to dominate sovereign debt issuance. Nathan Rothschild, operating out of London, was the strategic genius. During the Napoleonic Wars, he arranged enormous loans for Britain. But his innovation was not just lending to governments, it was how he structured everything. Instead of lending directly and waiting years for repayment, he would buy government bonds at a discount and immediately resell them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market where debt instruments could be traded like commodities. The government needed money immediately. Rothschild provided cash up front. Then he sold the bonds to pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals. The government got its money fast. Rothschild collected the spread. And investors got a tradable asset that paid interest. But here is where it gets darker. Rothschild did not just finance governments. He positioned himself so governments had no choice but to use his services. He became indispensable. In 1815 at Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His private courier network was faster than official channels. He used this advantage to manipulate the British bond market. First, he sold bonds aggressively, signaling that Britain was losing. Prices collapsed as other investors panicked. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When official news of British victory arrived the next day, prices surged. Rothschild made millions from controlling information flow and market timing. This established the Rothschild model: control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed to borrow, it went through the Rothschilds because they controlled the investor networks and set the terms. Here is why this matters. Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically default. If a king refused to pay, creditors lost money and the system reset. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across international borders. A British bond might be owned by a French insurance company, which sold it to a German bank, which used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting was not just refusing one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. This is the Rothschild innovation. Make the debt so interconnected that default becomes impossible. Not because governments are responsible, but because default would trigger systemic collapse that would hurt everyone. Governments became trapped. They had to keep making payments. And they had to keep borrowing to pay interest on old debts. The debt trap was no longer just permanent, it was inescapable. The Rothschild family peaked in the mid-1800s as the richest family in the world, and that wealth came from one source: interest payments on sovereign debt. They did not produce anything. They lent money to governments and collected interest forever. The system Paterson created, Rothschild industrialized and scaled globally by 1815. By 1900, America was becoming an economic powerhouse. But it still had a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. The money supply was tied to gold. There was no central mechanism to manage government debt. J.P. Morgan fixed that problem, not for the public good, but to protect his banking empire. In 1907, there was a severe financial panic. Stock prices crashed. Banks failed. The economy seized up. J.P. Morgan personally organized a bailout. He gathered major New York bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their money to stabilize failing banks. It worked. The panic ended, and Morgan became the de facto central banker of America. But Morgan was 70 years old and knew he could not do this again. So Morgan and his associates designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been shut down by populist opposition, so Morgan's group had to disguise it. In November 1910, a small group took a private train to Jekyll Island, Georgia. The group included Senator Nelson Aldrich, top Morgan partners, and representatives from the largest banks. For 9 days, they met in secret, designing the Federal Reserve System. The meetings were secret because if the public discovered that private bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, there would be riots. The plan had to appear as a government creation. The plan was brilliant manipulation. It would not be called a central bank. It would be the Federal Reserve System. It would not be one institution in New York. It would be 12 regional banks. It would not be controlled by Wall Street. It would be overseen by a board of governors appointed by the president. It looked decentralized, democratic, public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks. Those banks elected 2/3 of the directors. The most important power, the power to create money and purchase government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled by the largest Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, and immediately the debt trap expanded to an unprecedented scale. Now, the government did not just borrow from private banks with limited capital, it borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money from nothing to purchase government bonds. There was unlimited demand for government debt. Here is why this is critical. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a practical limit to government borrowing. Banks only had so much capital to lend, but the Federal Reserve removed that discipline entirely. The government issues a bond, the Federal Reserve purchases it with newly created money, the government spends it, and the debt goes on the Federal Reserve balance sheet, backed only by the promise that future taxpayers will service it forever. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there is always a buyer for government bonds, so the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever because the Federal Reserve will always purchase whatever the market will not absorb. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that makes America's current $38 trillion possible. Without the Federal Reserve as buyer of last resort, the government could not borrow at this scale. With the Federal Reserve's infinite capacity, there is no limit. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the debt trap was functioning globally. Every developed nation borrowed continuously. But developing nations were different. They borrowed heavily, and many were struggling. The debt trap was reaching its limits, threatening to collapse as poor nations defaulted. Then Paul Volcker made it permanent and inescapable worldwide. Paul Volcker was appointed Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979. He faced a crisis. Inflation was over 10%. America's credibility was eroding. Foreign governments were losing faith in the dollar. He needed to stop inflation immediately, even if it caused severe recession. So in 1979, Volcker raised interest rates dramatically. The federal funds rate rose from 11% to 20%, the highest in American history. This crushed inflation, but it had another effect. Developing nations had borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars during the 1970s when rates were low. Now those loans were coming due, and interest rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil owed $60 billion, Argentina owed $40 billion, and they could not pay. The interest alone exceeded their export revenues. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not make payments. Default. This should have triggered global financial collapse. American banks had lent most of that money. If Mexico defaulted, Citibank, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan would take catastrophic losses. Some might fail entirely. Volcker could have let it happen, let banks take losses for making bad loans, let the market clear, but he did not. Instead, Volcker orchestrated a bailout through the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund would lend Mexico, Brazil, Argentina enough money to keep making interest payments to American banks. These were called structural adjustment loans, and they came with brutal conditions. Governments had to cut spending drastically, privatize state assets, selling national industries to foreign investors at fire sale prices, open markets to foreign competition, devalue currencies, essentially dismantle their economic sovereignty in exchange for money to keep paying interest to foreign banks. And here is the key. The International Monetary Fund loans did not reduce debt. They just rolled it over, made it manageable short-term but permanent long-term. Countries could make payments, but they would be making payments forever. And the price was surrendering control over their economic policies. This is the Volcker innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, do not forgive it. Restructure it, lend just enough to keep interest flowing, and extract political and economic concessions in exchange. The debt trap became a tool of control. Countries that could not pay were forced to open their economies, sell their assets, submit to foreign economic policy, all for the privilege of staying in debt. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, the same structure. International Monetary Fund loans to keep paying interest. Austerity imposed. Sovereignty surrendered. And the debt never eliminated, just restructured and extended. Volcker died in 2019. But his legacy is the mechanism that ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when countries mathematically cannot pay, they are not allowed to default. They are refinanced into permanent indebtedness. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Start with Patterson's model from 1694. The government borrows, pays interest forever, and never repays principal. Debt is permanent by design. Next, add the Rothschild innovation from the 1800s. Make debt tradable globally and create complex webs of ownership. When default would collapse the entire system, default becomes unthinkable. Add Morgan's mechanism from 1913. Central banks create money to purchase government bonds, creating unlimited demand. The government can always borrow more. Add Volcker's trap from 1982. When countries cannot pay, do not allow default. Restructure the debt and lend more to pay interest on old money. Keep payments flowing. Do not permit no default to mean true cancellation. The result is what we have today. $315 trillion in global debt, government debt, corporate debt, and household debt, all interconnected. None will ever be fully repaid. All pays interest continuously. And everything is linked, so default anywhere threatens collapse everywhere. Here is the specific mechanism. The United States government has issued $38 trillion in debt. Who owns it? Approximately $20 trillion is owned by American institutions, including pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve. These institutions purchase treasury bonds because they are considered the safest asset. But those bonds pay interest, currently about $1 trillion per year. That interest comes from tax revenues. Taxpayers send money to the government. The government sends it to bondholders. The bondholders are mostly institutions owned by the wealthy. It is a transfer from workers to capital, operating every year, forever. The other $18 trillion is owed to the government itself, to Social Security and Medicare. The government borrowed from these programs and spent the money. Now it owes itself. But ultimately, taxpayers owe, because when Social Security needs to redeem those bonds, the government has to raise taxes or borrow more. Now scale this globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, mostly to Japanese institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe owes $14 trillion, mostly to European banks and the European Central Bank. China owes trillions of dollars in domestic debt held by state banks. Every country runs the same system, and they are interconnected. Japan holds United States Treasury bonds. The United States holds European debt through the International Monetary Fund. Europe holds developing nation debt through the World Bank. It is circular. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to the institutions that manage the debt. Here is why this can never end. If the United States paid off its $38 trillion, the money supply would collapse catastrophically. Dollars are created when the government borrows. When the Federal Reserve purchases treasury bonds, it creates new dollars. Those dollars become the money supply. If the government paid off the debt, those dollars would disappear. They would be removed from circulation. The money supply would shrink by trillions. Deflation, depression, economic collapse would follow immediately. So the government can never pay it off. It has to keep borrowing continuously and keep rolling the debt over endlessly. The system requires ever-increasing debt just to maintain the money supply. The same is true globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3 or more. There would not be enough money to conduct international trade. The system would seize up, commerce would stop. So debt cannot be eliminated. It is not a problem to solve. It is structural, necessary, required by the design of the monetary system. And here is who profits from this arrangement: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These massive asset managers control tens of trillions. They purchase government bonds using other people's money, pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and they collect the interest, approximately $1 trillion per year from US debt alone, plus interest from bonds worldwide. That trillion per year flows from taxpayers through governments to bondholders. It is the largest wealth transfer in human history, operating continuously, structurally embedded, and invisible to most people because it is not called a tax. It is called debt service. But the mechanism is identical. Workers pay, institutions collect, and the debt never decreases. The four architects did not meet in a room and conspire. They lived in different centuries, operated in different countries, and faced different problems, but each one solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers. And each solution built directly on the previous one. Paterson made debt permanent in 1694 by creating the Bank of England and establishing that governments would never repay principal. Rothschild made debt global and inescapable in 1815 by creating secondary markets and interconnected ownership. Morgan made debt infinite in 1913 by creating the Federal Reserve and ensuring unlimited demand for government bonds. Volcker made escape inescapable in 1982 by preventing defaults and restructuring unpayable debts into permanent obligations. Together, across 3 centuries, they built a system where governments borrow forever, pay interest eternally, and can never escape. And the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt portfolios, who collect the interest payments, they are the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers, not citizens. The financial institutions. And here is the final truth. $38 trillion in American debt is not a crisis for them. It is not a problem keeping them awake. It is a business model. Every dollar of government debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays steady interest. It provides collateral for additional borrowing. It is considered the safest investment available. And as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe the government will continue paying interest, even if it never repays principal, the system functions perfectly. The debt trap is complete. It is operating exactly as designed, and escape is not possible. Not without collapsing the entire financial system, destroying the money supply, and triggering global economic catastrophe. 4 architects, separated by centuries, each building one layer. Paterson made it permanent. Rothschild made it global. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it inescapable. And everyone on earth is now caught inside the machine they built. If this changed how you see government debt, if you finally understand that $38 trillion is not an accident or a mistake or a failure of political will, but rather a system working exactly as designed, then you are starting to see how power actually operates. Because they are not going to teach you this in schools. They are going to teach you that debt is a problem that needs solving, that politicians are irresponsible, that we need to tighten our belts and pay it down. But the architects knew something different. They knew that debt is not a problem at all. It is the foundation of the system, and interest payments are the rent we pay for living inside their machine.